Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the start of a new series that we will be doing for the next 10 to 12 weeks, studying the patriarchs. These are the men that we find in the book of Genesis that are the foundation of faith. We'll be talking about 5 different men over the next few weeks, beginning with Abraham and working our way through to finish with Joseph. And in each of these men's lives, and in the stories that we find in the book of Genesis, we're going to see how God works in their life to bring them from a point of weakness to a possibility of redemption of that weakness, and for some, the achievement of overcoming that weakness, and for others, a failure to do so, and they're being removed from the line of faith. So in each of these men's lives, we see a call for us today of how we can interact with God to overcome weaknesses in our area, in different areas of our life, and also to find strength in time of trouble. The opportunities that God gives us and how He remains faithful even in our times of weakness to give us a chance to grow in Him. And so we will begin with the first of the patriarchs, a man called Abraham. And he is considered the father of faith, the first in a line of believers that stretches through Judaism and into modern day Christianity, and also is considered the father of even the Islamic faith through Ishmael. And so we're going to see opportunities that God worked with him to overcome difficulties in his life, failures in his life, that even though he is called the father of faith, he had struggles just like we do. And we will begin with the book of Genesis, chapter 12. And I want to read several verses there as we start looking at Abraham. We want to see Abraham's call, how this began. How did God bring about the start of this journey of faith that leads us to where we are today? So talking about the call of Abraham, we read in Genesis chapter 12, beginning with verse 1. And it says, "Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get out of your country, and from your kindred, and from your father's house, unto a land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless you, and curse him that curses you. And in you shall all families of the earth be blessed. So Abraham departed, as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran, and they went forth to go into the land of Canaan. And into the land of Canaan they came. And Abram passed through the land unto the place of Sichem, unto the plain of Moreh. And the Canaanite was then in the land. And the Lord appeared unto Abram, and said, Unto your seed will I give this land. And there he builded an altar unto the Lord, who appeared unto him. And he removed from there unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west, and Hai on the east. And there he builded an altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord. So here we see the beginning of Abraham's journey of faith. It's actually a literal journey for Abraham, as well as a metaphorical journey of faith, that God calls to him after years of living in a place called Haran. God calls to him and says, leave your family, leave this place that you know, trust me, follow where I lead you, and I'm going to take you to a land that I will give to you and your descendants, and I will make you a great nation in this land. So we have a promise of God that is contingent upon obedience. That if Abraham would get up, if he would go, if he would leave, then God would bless him and his descendants. So we see a decision that Abraham has to make, and often people consider this to be Abraham's great act of faith, that he gets up from his hometown or from the town of Haran where he had been living. He originally was from Ur, had moved to Haran, and now it was time to leave again. And we see this as a great act of faith, but when we really study it out, we find that it was not demonstrating complete dependence on God. He took his closest family members. He had his wife go with him. He had his nephew go with him. He took all of his wealth, all of the material possessions that he had. And so when we look at this, it's not as much an act of faith as it is an act of obedience. That when God calls Abraham to leave and go to Canaan and be blessed there, that promise does start something. And it starts something that continues down all the way to us today, but it's actually an act of obedience. And the reason I want to point that out is this act of obedience rather than faith shows the big failure or struggle that Abraham had throughout all his life, one that plagued him for years to come, that we're going to see over today's session and over the next session, several instances of evidence that show us this weakness, this failure, and it's not one we often think of. When we talk about Abraham, we talk about his faith, the man of faith, Father Abraham, but the true failure that Abraham had was weak faith. You say, how is that so? Here's a man who got up, he left. Didn't that require trusting God? Didn't that require believing in him? Yes, it did. But it wasn't a complete faith, a complete reliance on God. There were some weak elements that we're going to see in 3 different exhibits over the next couple of weeks that show the weak faith that Abraham had. I'm not saying that Abraham did not trust God, but that he wavered in that faith. And if we really get down to it, don't many of us find ourselves in that same situation where we trust God, we have faith, but there are times that we waver, there are times that we falter, times that our faith isn't quite up to the standard. I'm reminded of the man in Mark chapter 9 who has the demon-possessed son, and he tries to have the disciples deliver the son, and Jesus comes down from the Mount of Transfiguration and says to him in a conversation, the man says to Jesus, if you can do anything, help us. And Jesus said, you must believe. To whoever believes, all things are possible. And the man replies, I believe, help my unbelief. In that, we see the situation that so many of us find ourselves in from time to time, where we trust God, we believe, but there are areas of unbelief, there are areas of weakness. And we see that with Abraham. And as we go through the study, we'll find that yes, he had this weakness, yes, he had this difficulty, but God was faithful throughout it all to help him grow and mature and overcome this difficulty of weak faith. So let's look at some of the evidence we have that shows that weakness of faith. And in fact, that weakness shows up almost immediately after Abraham gets into the land of Canaan. We read the first half of Genesis chapter 12, where God calls Abram, as Abraham was known at that time, he was known as Abram first. God calls him and he leaves Haran, he goes into Canaan. It seems like he's trusting God properly. But as we get to the second half of Genesis chapter 12, when we see difficulty arise, we start to see the weakness of Abraham's faith. So let's pick up in verse 10 of Genesis chapter 12. It says, and there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. So we see that difficulty arises. Often when we are following God, when we are trusting God, things start off great, but then difficulty will arise. And here in Abram's situation, he gets into the land of Canaan. God promises, I will give you and your descendants this land. And then trouble, a famine. Rather than continue to trust God to provide and remain in the land of Canaan during this famine, Abram decides to leave. And he goes to Egypt. This alone is an issue that shows a weakness of faith, a failure to rely on God in this time of difficulty. But it also sets the stage for the first big evidence of Abram's weak faith. And that is the fact that he, throughout multiple times in the next few chapters, he repeatedly lies about Sarah, his wife. If we read on, after he gets to Egypt, look at what happens beginning in verse 11. And it came to pass, when he was come near to enter into Egypt, that he said to Sarai his wife, Behold, now I know that you are a fair woman to look upon. Therefore it shall come to pass, when the Egyptians shall see you, that they will say, This is his wife, and they will kill me, but save you alive. So I pray you, you are my sister. He says, Say, I pray you, that you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and my soul shall live because of you. So Abraham is worried that because of Sarah's beauty, that the people of Egypt will kill him so that they can have Sarah. Because they knew that Sarah was his wife, they would kill Abram to have Sarah. So he says, Tell them instead that you are my sister, and then they won't kill me, and all will be well. So this again shows a lack of trusting God, a weakness of faith, that rather than trust God to protect them in this situation, to provide a covering that God would not allow the Egyptians to kill Abram, Abram doesn't trust that. Instead, he makes a plan of his own to have Sarah say that she is his sister. Now, this is not a complete lie. She was his half-sister. She was the daughter of one parent, but not the other. And so it's not a complete lie, but it's also not the complete truth. And it shows a lack of trusting in God. So when we look at what happens, the result of this lack of trust is that the very thing Abram was trying to avoid happens. When we pick up the story in verse 14, it says, And it came to pass that when Abram had come into Egypt, the Egyptians beheld the woman, that she was very fair. The princes also of Pharaoh saw her, and commended her before Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And he treated Abram well for her sake, and gave him sheep and oxen and donkeys and men servants and maid servants and female donkeys and camels. And the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So we see that the very thing that Abram was trying to avoid, the loss of his wife, ended up happening despite his plans. When he tried to take matters into his own hands and deal with the situation himself and come up with a plan that will say that you're my sister and then it will be fine, he ends up losing his wife anyway. Now I want to notice here that Pharaoh taking Sarah into the harem, Pharaoh did so in good faith. Pharaoh believed Abram that Sarah was his sister. So he took Sarah into his harem of wives without thinking that it was Abram's wife and not thinking he was doing anything wrong. So the very last verse we read there, and the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife, shows us how God remains faithful even in our failures. So Abram had this failure, and he told Pharaoh that Sarah was his sister, but instead, God protects the situation by sending these plagues upon Pharaoh's house to keep him from consummating the relationship with Sarah. And that prevents that problem and causes Pharaoh to realize what's going on. If we read again in verse 17, it says, The Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, What is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? I might have taken her as my wife. Now therefore, here is your wife. Take her and go away. And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent Abram away and his wife and all that he had. So the situation here that we find is that conflict arises as a result of Abram's weak faith. That because he didn't trust God, conflict arises between Abram and Pharaoh that leads to Abram having to leave the land of Egypt. God was faithful, protected Abram. He did not lose his wife. Sarah remained his wife and was not taken by Pharaoh, but he has to leave. The one place that during a famine food could be guaranteed to have was in Egypt. because of the Nile River and the flooding of the Nile. You could always grow crops in the Nile Valley. Egypt had food even in difficult times of famine. The one place that that provision could have been sustained separate from God is now lost to Abraham. When we try to take matters into our own hands and we try to come up with a plan to accomplish something rather than trusting God to protect us in that situation, we find that the very thing we're trying to avoid will happen to us often, or we will lose what we're trying to gain. And then we see this with Abram in both situations. He was seeking to avoid the loss of his wife, and it happened anyway. And he was trying to gain a source of food and provision, and he lost that. So when we refuse to trust God or choose to trust ourselves more than trusting God, we end up losing what we're trying to gain and ending up experiencing those things we're trying to avoid. So we learn a great truth from the second half of Genesis chapter 12, that this weakness of faith led to conflict and led to problems. But we also can see in it the faithfulness of God, that God protected and kept Sarah from being taken by Pharaoh. But more than that, when God had Pharaoh force Abram out of the land of Egypt, and Abram has to return to the land of Canaan, it means that Abraham then has to rely on God and not on his own plans. God orchestrated a situation to return Abram to a place of faith, to return him to a situation of trusting in God rather than in his own plans. Now that brings us to a point where, okay, Abram is back in the land of Canaan. Obviously, he's trusting God again, right? Again, not fully. Just like so many of us, Abram doesn't learn the lesson the first time. Maybe you're like me, that we've gotten into situations before where things, we try to take it into our own hands. We try to do what we think is best, and it just falls apart because God's not in it. And God rescues us from that. And then a little while later, we find ourselves doing the same thing again. We don't learn the lesson. We're hard-headed. And Abram is exactly that same way, because if we go a few chapters later, we go to Genesis chapter 20, we find that Abram does the same thing again and tells Abimelech, the king of Gerar, that Sarah is his sister. We find this in Genesis chapter 20, and we're going to begin in verses 1 through 18. Now, I'm going to read a lot here, but I want us to understand the story. This is several years later, 15, 20 years later, that Abram finds himself in another situation with another group of people, the people of Gerar, a city in Canaan. And it says, and Abram journeyed from there towards the south country and dwelled between Kadesh and Shur, and sojourned or journeyed in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, the king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night, and said to him, behold, you are only a dead man, for the woman whom you have taken, she is a man's wife. But Abimelech had not come near her. And he said, Lord, will you slay also a righteous nation? Did he not say to me, she is my sister? And she, even she herself, said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and innocency of my hands have I done this. And God said unto him in a dream, yes, I know that you did this in the integrity of your heart, for I also withheld you from sinning against me. Therefore I did not allow you to touch her. Now therefore restore the man his wife, for he is a prophet, and he shall pray for you, and you will live. And if you restore her not, understand that you will surely die, you and all that are yours. Therefore Abimelech rose early in the morning, and called all his servants, and told all these things in their ears, and the men were sore afraid. And Abimelech called Abraham, and said to him, What have you done to us? How have I offended you, that you have brought on me and on my kingdom this great sin? You have done deeds unto me that ought not to be done. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you see that you have done this thing?